Welcome to Felony Friday, a presentation of the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here is your host, John Odermatt.
Felons, friends, and freedom lovers, welcome back to Felony Friday, right here on the Lions of Liberty podcast. Felony Friday is the show where each and every week I focus on exposing injustice in the very, very broken criminal justice system in this country. Here on the Lions of Liberty podcast, I am one of three shows. We have a Monday show hosted by Marc Clair. It's our longest running show, and each and every Monday, Marc will bring on a leading mind, a brilliant mind from the Liberty Movement, or he'll host a round table with the brilliant minds here at Lions of Liberty. And he's added a new segment, a new feature called Letters of Liberty that he's trying to do each and every Monday. You can submit questions, any questions on politics, on libertarian principles. You can ask Marc those questions. An easy way to do that is by joining our online Facebook forum, our Facebook group. It's called the Lions of Liberty Forum. You can join it by going to facebook.com and punching Lions of Liberty Forum in that search bar right at the top, and we'll get you approved. And you can join a great group of people to talk about the ideas of liberty, and you can also submit some questions for Marc for Letters of Liberty. On Wednesday, we have our newest show hosted by Brian McWilliams called Electric Liberty Land, and Brian's doing some really cool things, talking through current events, talking through, really analyzing the early presidency of Donald Trump, and he has a new feature called Trump or Dump, so you can tell which one's good, which one's bad, I think. And of course, every Friday of this show, Felony Friday. So you definitely want to check out all three shows and subscribe to the Lions of Liberty podcast, either on iTunes or Stitcher or any other plethora of podcasting apps. Now, today on Felony Friday, I'm really excited. I got a great guest. I'm bringing on a really knowledgeable guest. I'm going to be interviewing constitutional expert and educator KrisAnne Hall, and we're going to be talking primarily about the Cox Kettler case in Kansas, which has made national headlines. It's outraged a lot of people, people in the liberty movement. It's outraged a lot of constitutionalists, a lot of people who care about individual rights. Everyone is talking about it, and the country really is focused on Kansas here. We're going to get the update there from KrisAnne, and we're going to talk about some other things as well, but that will be the focus of the show. This is actually KrisAnne's second time on the show. The first time was back on episode 194 with Marc Clair. Marc had KrisAnne on, and I will link to that in the show notes, which can be found at lionsofliberty.com/FF59, because this is the 59th episode of Felony Friday. Just one more note before we get started. Recently, we've launched a couple opportunities for you guys as listeners to help us to grow this show, help us to fund this show. We launched our Lions of Liberty store, which can be found at lionsofliberty.store. We've got some comfortable, high-quality, really eye-catching designs. Really, we wouldn't sell you something unless we were comfortable wearing it ourselves. Check those out. Go to Lions of Liberty store and check out some shirts. Buy some shirts. We're going to have some koozies coming soon, so really excited about that. A second way you can help, and you can help on a more regular basis, a monthly basis, is you can become a patron of the Lions of Liberty podcast. You can do that by going to lionsofliberty.com/support, reading about it there, and you can register through Podbean at a couple different levels that we have, different tiers. You're going to get more stuff based on the more you donate. You get certain percentage stuff off, stuff in the store, and some exclusive content, other things like that. And of course, all of this stuff, everything we make is going right back into this show, right back into this program to help us to grow the show, help us to advertise on some other shows, hopefully, and maybe eventually add some more shows. I don't know if we get enough money, and maybe do some live shows, things like that, travel a little bit. The sky's really the limit based on how much feedback we get from you guys and how much contributions we get from you guys will really help us to dictate what we can do with this show. So we're really excited about it, and we're looking forward to the future here, and I'm looking forward to this episode with KrisAnne Hall. So I hope you enjoy today's show. Today on Felony Friday, we welcome constitutional expert and educator KrisAnne Hall. KrisAnne has a diverse background. She's an Army veteran, a Russian linguist, and a former prosecutor who has become a passionate advocate for constitutional concerns. Now, this is KrisAnne's second time appearing on the Lions of Liberty podcast. She first appeared back on episode 194 with host Marc Clair. So for KrisAnne's full backstory and to hear all about that, you can check out that episode. We'll touch on that here. But to hear everything, make sure to go back and check that out. I'll link to it in the show notes. KrisAnne was gracious enough to give us some more time today. So I want to stick to more current events. And for the most part, we'll be sticking to talking about the Cox and Kettler Second Amendment case in Kansas. KrisAnne, welcome to Felony Friday.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Thank you for coming back on the show. We really do appreciate it. I know you have a very busy schedule, so it's great to have some of your time. And I do want to, like I said in the intro, I do want to talk mostly about this Cox and Kettler case because it is such an important case for this country, such an important fight that I think we have in front of us. But for the small percentage of people out there who maybe don't know who you are, people out there listening who haven't heard of you, could you give maybe a brief, as brief as could be expected, sort of your backstory? How did you become a passionate advocate for the Constitution? What are some of the key events in your life that molded you into this activist that you've become today?
Well, I went to law school and started reading on my own and discovered that we weren't being taught the Constitution in law school. And sort of that it sparked the inner rebellion. And I started reading what the framers themselves wrote. And it really, that's part of what sparked a passion there, was I fell in love with these people who sacrificed everything so that we could have liberty. And I just wanted to know more and more and more. And the more I learned and the more I knew, the more I discovered that we don't teach the truth anymore about the Constitution. We don't even teach history anymore the way it's supposed to be taught in reality. We teach history based on philosophy and psychology. We don't teach history based on fact anymore. And so I started learning. I was a prosecutor for about a decade. I also practiced First Amendment law for about 2 years, and it just really, I don't know, it's how does a spark? It's kind of hard to put your finger on that kind of thing, but in reality, it was just a desire to share with other people what I had come to know for myself. And I started teaching, talking on the radio. I eventually got fired by the state of Florida for teaching the Constitution because they didn't like who I was teaching it to or how I was teaching it. And then that sort of set us out on this path of I guess, constitutional evangelism, if you will. This teaching all over the country. I do about 265 events in over 22 states every single year. And I have a radio show, a television show, and I write books and have DVDs, and that's why I'm on the show. How's that? Great. Well, was that a good summary? I don't know. I think I might have left
that was good. That was good. And I hate to say that I'm happy that you got fired from your prosecutor job, but I think it's been a gift to the liberty movement and to constitutionalists out there to have you having the freedom to go around and do this, to teach what you know so well.
Yeah, I think the biggest advantage is that I have is that I'm a recovering liberal. So I've come to know the truth as the truth because I believed the lies. So I was able to cross-examine the lies and see the truth.
Yeah, I think that's key. I came from the other side, came from the neoconservative side, so I can see. I do have a hard time relating to liberals today, to progressives today, seeing where they're coming from. But I can always relate back more to the conservative, neoconservative side, and I think that's important. I think that's an advantage that libertarians and more, I guess, independents have over the other two parties, is we came from one of those two sides. So in arguments, we already know where the other side's sort of coming from.
Yeah, it's hard to find a neocon or a real constitutionalist that converted to being a liberal.
Right, exactly. I don't think there's ever been one. But so let's jump in and talk about this Cox Kettler case. I've heard you on a couple different podcasts. I've heard you talk about it on your show, and I think on the Jason Stapleton program as well. And for anyone out there who hasn't heard of this, or maybe they've just heard little bits of it, essentially Shane Cox and Jeremy Kettler were arrested in Kansas, and they're arrested they thought they were following a state law, or they were following a state law, but they were violating federal law. So can you, start out by talking about what was this state law that they thought they were following, and when was it passed, and then we'll jump in and talk about the federal law.
Well, the key to understanding this is it's called the Second Amendment Protection Act, and the whole purpose of the state law was to prevent the execution of federal law within Kansas borders in very certain circumstances. And so the body of the law says that if a firearm, accessory, or ammunition is manufactured in Kansas, sold in Kansas, and bought by a Kansas resident, therefore it does not it does not fall under interstate commerce. So since it's not interstate commerce, it is not subject to federal regulation. And the law actually goes one step further and then says any federal agent who is found trying to enforce a federal law contrary to the Second Amendment Protection Act is guilty of a felony offense at the state level and is to be prosecuted accordingly. And so what happened was Shane Cox is a gun dealer, so he manufactures a suppressor, and he has a store in Kansas. And Jeremy Kettler is a veteran and a Kansas resident, and he goes into Mr. Cox's store and sees the suppressor. Jeremy Kettler, as a veteran, had service-connected damage to his ears, and so he was getting a suppressor to help mitigate further damage.
Right.
And so he saw the suppressor. Right there in the case, next to the suppressor was a copy of the Kansas law that said, we're not subject to federal law on this, and so this is all you have to do to buy it, so buy it. And that's exactly what they did. They complied with the letter of law. Now, I think it's very relevant to say that Jeremy Kettler was not avoiding the federal law because he would have been denied if he had to, if he would have had to comply. So there was nothing on his record to keep him from purchasing the suppressor. It was just, it's easier, it's quicker, and you don't have to comply with all of the red tape and that sort of thing.
Right. He would have passed a background check or any of that stuff.
Right. And had passed a background check. And so Jeremy and Shane then find themselves being prosecuted by federal agents. And the bad thing is, the first wrong thing is we have a local prosecutor and a local sheriff aiding in the arrest and prosecution of Cox and Kettler, even though these people are not following the state law by assisting the federal agents in prosecuting these men contrary to the Second Amendment Protection Act. So they're brought into federal court, and then two more really bad things happen. The first is the legislators who passed this law, over 80%, it was a huge cross-partisan, bipartisan action. Over 80% of the legislators in the entire state voted in favor of the Second Amendment Protection Act, and then all of a sudden they're absent. There's nobody there to say, hey, wait a minute, this law protects these people. The governor refused to do anything. The attorney general refused to do anything. And when the Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, tried to do something, the attorney general impeded the Secretary of State from coming to the defense of the Kansas law and coming to the defense of these men. The second bad thing that happened is the federal judge over this case, J. Thomas Martin, decided unilaterally that Kansas law is not relevant in his federal courtroom. So he refused to allow these men to present their criminal defense, which was, we're following the state law, and that's why we can't be guilty of knowingly violating the federal law. This judge said because Kansas law is irrelevant in this state, their defense is inadmissible. So these men were forced to create a defense that was not their own, but a defense that was forced upon them by the judge of this court. And so the jury never got to see that these men were actually complying with every aspect and every letter of Kansas law. They never even got to know about the Kansas law. And the jurors found them guilty of violating the federal law. And
wow. What did the judge base that on, that saying Kansas law was irrelevant? Is there any historical precedence for that? Are there any other rulings?
His justification was that federal law is superior to state law. He has an erroneous understanding of the supremacy clause, and an erroneous elevation of his own authority and power. He said to us at the sentencing, he said, because we had a whole bunch of people calling him and sending him emails and writing him letters, and he gave this whole 15-minute, very condescending speech about how, I'm so happy that we have the First Amendment, and I appreciate your concerns, and I read all the emails. And then he said, but all you people telling me that I didn't know the law, you don't have to tell me the law. I'm the judge. I know the law. And he says, it's my duty to follow the law. And I will follow, these are his words now, because I took notes. He said, I will follow the law as best as I am to determine it to be. So we have a judge, and this is the unfortunate circumstance of our court system in general, but more specifically in our federal court system. We have judges who believe that they are not only the ultimate arbiters of the Constitution, but they are the ultimate arbiters of the law and how they themselves are to follow the law. So they define the law, they interpret the law, and even when the law applies to them. And that is just the very definition of arbitrary despotism.
That's truly unbelievable. What sentences do Cox and Kettler have? Are they in prison right now, or what are they dealing with?
No, they could have gone to prison, but the judge sentenced them to probation. And so they got, Jeremy Kettler got 1 year of probation, and Shane Cox got 2 years of probation. Now, here's the problem. Those probations strip them of their civil rights. And so Jeremy Kettler's a veteran. He's called a hero. He's put himself in harm's way to defend our liberty. He should be called a hero, but now he's called a felony, a criminal, and he cannot vote. He has to relinquish all his firearms. He will never be able to buy a firearm again in his life, all because the legislators of the state of Kansas and the governor of the state of Kansas signed a law into effect and then abandoned its citizens to be entrapped in a federal prosecution.
We talk about that a lot on this show, about how felons, former felons, people who have been released, they're back in society, they're contributing value, have their rights taken away, they have their right to own a gun taken away. Where does that come from? What law has been written on the books federally? Because I know it's different. Some states have some different laws regarding Second Amendment rights for felons. But what is there a federal law written that they're saying trumps the Second Amendment?
Well, there are many federal laws and regulations they say trump the Second Amendment. The question should not be what law, but what authority do they have to do that? And the authority is none. It is a cruel and unusual punishment. The only way you should lose your liberty to own a firearm is if you are found guilty by a jury of your peers of using that firearm to harm someone else. That's the limitations of liberty, is that your liberty should have no boundary except that you cannot harm someone else. So the point in which you use a firearm to take someone else's life or someone else's property unjustly, you have not had your rights stripped from you. You have relinquished them because of your abuse of them. And what we see now is this term felon, as the defining pinnacle of who gets to have rights and who doesn't get to have rights. And many times, I'm sure, as you know, it's absolutely ridiculous. I can tell you, as a former prosecutor in the state of Florida, if you are caught, if you are found guilty of driving without a driver's license 3 times, you are now a felon and you cannot vote and you cannot buy a firearm.
Unbelievable that in a country that purports itself to be a free country, we can have a law like that. But these nonviolent, crimes in air quotes, many of them drug offenses, can strip someone of their right to defend themselves, their family, their property for the rest of their life. It's truly unbelievable.
No, it's a punishment of slavery, is what it is.
It is. It absolutely is. Back onto the Cox and Kettler case. Where do we go from here? Is there a chance this goes to the Supreme Court?
Well, we have a very, very good friend. His name is Joe Miller. He actually ran for congressman in Alaska, but he's originally a Kansas resident, a Kansas native Kansan, and he is going to take up their case pro bono. The U.S. Justice Foundation. He is the executive officer of the U.S. Justice Foundation, and they're a not-for-profit law firm that takes up cases like this. And those who want to see it, they can go to my YouTube channel. I actually interviewed him after the hearing, and he's a friend of mine, so we had a good conversation, and we're all very convinced that the appeal will be successful because this judge, J. Thomas Martin, is his actions were so contrary to civil liberties that we cannot even believe that the 10th Circuit would uphold them.
When you think of Kansas, you think of it, at least I do, maybe I'm wrong, I'm in Pennsylvania, but I think of Kansas as being more friendly to civil liberty, be more friendly to individual liberty overall than places on the coast. So it is surprising for something like this to be coming out of Kansas.
It is surprising, but I think it's real indicative of the epidemic problem in America. This federal supremacy mentality combined by politicians who are willing to do things that are politically advantageous, but unwilling to actually stand behind their actions when conviction is necessary.
I'm glad you brought that up, because this is a thought that one of my fellow co-founders here at Lions of Liberty, Marc Clair, brought up to me. Let's say, I don't think this is going to happen, but let's imagine for a minute that either Donald Trump or maybe someone after, maybe we get a more libertarian president down the road. What is it possible? Would it be possible for a president in the using his role in the executive branch to enforce the Second Amendment? Say if a state banned the use of firearms, to use the federal government to intervene to really nullify from the federal level the state law?
No, that's not the role of the president. The role of the president is to faithfully execute the laws of the federal government. It is not the role of the president to intervene when a state has gone rogue. The intervention has to come from the people on the state level. And what the president should be doing, and what we should be more concerned about, is a president who's willing to defend the Constitution by simply saying, we will no longer have an ATF. We will no longer have an executive agency in the regulation of firearms. And or at least say, in the very least, this agency will not regulate within the states. The ATF's only responsibility will be to regulate within the boundaries of Washington, D.C. and any federal property. Because we need to get the federal government out of the states altogether. We cannot have a federal militia, a standing army enforcing laws within the states.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from there. So I want to pivot here just to talk about any similarities that you see between this Kansas Second Amendment Act and the many states that have now legalized or decriminalized marijuana, both on recreational and for medical use.
Oh, there's a great similarity there, actually, because just as the federal government has no authority through the Constitution to regulate firearms, the federal government has no authority through the Constitution to regulate plants either. And so all of those types of regulations were things that would be reserved to the purview of the states to regulate. And so when the states are simply saying, you know what, we don't recognize the federal government's laws regarding our plants, because legally speaking, that's what we're talking about. Most
Right.
people who are informed on marijuana law realize that the whole basis for the federal government regulating marijuana is a federal case regarding wheat. And so what they've done is said one plant is subject to interstate commerce, and therefore marijuana being a plant is subject to interstate commerce. But that power was never delegated to the federal government. So the states are well within their sovereign right to say, plants are ours and not the feds.
What's your gut feel on Jeff Sessions coming in? Do you think Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General, is somebody that would try to come into states and enforce marijuana laws in these states that have nullified the federal government?
Yeah, I have a great deal of concern about Jeff Sessions. Actually, he does not have a very good constitutional or liberty-minded track record. He is vehemently in favor of civil forfeitures, which is completely unconstitutional. He's vehemently in favor of warrantless searches and any type of government intervention if national security dictates. And so I do have a great deal of concern about Jeff Sessions in those kind of matters. And I know I do believe that you will find Jeff Sessions. It's a possibility that he could try to enforce these federal marijuana laws because that's one of his platforms, even though it's not constitutional.
Yeah, it's sort of a situation where we're not sure what's going to happen because Donald Trump, well, he switches back and forth in everything he says, but he did say when he was running during his candidacy that he wanted to leave it up to the states in regards to marijuana, but then he nominates Jeff Sessions for his position.
Right? And we know from Donald Trump's business history that although Donald is a strong leader strong CEO, he has a tendency to, once he has put his trust in someone, to just simply let them conduct their business without a lot of micromanaging.
It is concerning. And sticking to Trump, obviously what's been dominating the headlines recently is his executive order on immigration. Mm-hmm. From your perspective as a constitutional expert who has studied this, is his ban on those 7 countries, banning refugees and heavy vetting or trying to more heavily vet from these 7 countries, is that constitutional? Is that within the scope of the executive branch?
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than a yes or no answer because first off, refugee status in and of itself is unconstitutional. There is the only power delegated to the federal government regarding immigration is to create a uniform rule of naturalization. And so refugee status is completely contrary to that. A refugee status is not uniform. It's different from person to person. And it's not a pathway to naturalization. We have people who have been admitted into America under refugee status who have literally been in America for generations on refugee status without ever having to go through any kind of naturalization process or supervision or that kind of thing. So refugee status is already a reach outside of the Constitution. But if we're talking about the president's authority to operate within the law created, now and I'm saying we're going to have to kind of just simply ignore the fact that the whole thing is unconstitutional from the get-go, right? Right. If we ignore that the whole thing is unconstitutional from the get-go, what Donald Trump is doing is within his authority. But the real issue here is not whether Donald Trump is in his authority or not, but whether this judge is justified by his argument to create this ban or to create the injunction against the ban. And we're not asking the right questions because we're not getting the right answers because we're not asking the right questions. Anybody who reads Washington's complaint against Donald Trump's executive order has to come to the conclusion that there is no cause based on this complaint because the complaint never addresses a constitutional issue. See, we are having the discussion, is it constitutional in the public? But that was never, is it constitutional, brought before the court. And I think that might be shocking for some people to hear, that we think that this judge has determined that the ban was unconstitutional. But in reality, That argument was never made. The arguments that were made were based on Donald Trump's campaign speeches, not based on the executive order itself.
That's really interesting. So you're saying it was based on the complaint is based upon the Muslim ban that Donald Trump talked about during his campaign?
Yes, and not on the executive order.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, because Section 4 of their complaint is called is the allegations section, and every single allegation is based on a speech that Donald Trump made on his campaign, or one speech that he made after the inauguration about extreme vetting, which had no direct statement on Muslims or Islam or anything. It was just a statement of extreme vetting. And so the thing that we really need to see here, the real atrocity here, is that this judge, after reading this complaint that struck no legal argument, no constitutional argument whatsoever, declared that he believed that this argument would likely prevail at trial, which is why the injunction is to be mandated. You see, when you do what they call an interlocutory motion, which is what the injunction is, the judge has to determine whether he believes, by reasonable assumption, that the complaint would prevail at trial. And by issuing the injunction, he says, yes, the complaint will prevail, most likely prevail at trial. Well, that's the crazy thing.
Yeah.
Because there's no way a judge who is a good judge, who is a fair judge, who's a just judge, reading that complaint would ever allow it to prevail, because it makes no real argument.
Yeah, it sounds like the definition of legislating from the bench right there.
Well, the whole argument that Washington State makes is a non sequitur. It's an illogical. All of the complaints do not reach a logical conclusion.
Yep. Well, unfortunately, that's not surprising from a lot of the stuff we hear from the left. So
yeah.
It is what it is at this point. Not to defend Donald Trump or the immigration ban as what it is, but we have to call a spade and hold both sides accountable. I really want to thank you for coming on the show, KrisAnne. Before I let you go, would you please share with the Lions of Liberty audience where we can find your work, where we can find your podcast, and where everyone can follow you on social media?
My website is KrisAnneHall.com, KrisAnnehall.com. I have a YouTube channel under KrisAnne Hall. I am on Facebook. I am on Twitter. And all my radio shows can be found on my website. I have a mobile app that if you go to your app store and search my name, KrisAnne, KrisAnne, and then my last name, Hall, Hall, you can download my mobile app for free, and then you can have access to the YouTube videos and the radio shows whenever they're published.
Well, that is fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you. You can also get my calendar there, by the way, and see if I'm going to be in the area teaching. If you have the mobile app, we'll give you a push alert and let you know.
Thank you, KrisAnne.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for listening to today's show. This interview today is absolutely one that I'm going to be going back and listening to again to try to soak up some of the knowledge that she was dropping today, because I honestly could not process it all as she was saying it. This interview today is super important. Our liberties in this country, as many of you know, as many of the listeners of this show and of the Lions of Liberty podcast know, our liberties are constantly under attack. But there is so much political noise. There is so much nonsense floating around out there in the mainstream media, on the internet, on Facebook, on Twitter, that it gets lost. And it's hard to really focus on important cases like this, on important cases like the Cox and Kettler case. These cases do not get their due in today's media. The everyday American is not at all familiar with the details of this Cox and Kettler case. They don't know that two men have been saddled with felonies for the rest of their lives for doing nothing more than just following the law. They thought they were following state law that their legislators had passed and their governor had signed into law to protect them from federal overreach. Little did they know that their state representatives and their governor would quiver in a corner and wouldn't stand up and actually enforce that law and actually stand in the way of the federal overreach of the federal agents that came in and prosecuted their citizens. It's really an outrage when you look at it that way. These two men will not have the same life the rest of their lives. They will not have the same rights as you and I. They won't be able to carry a gun to defend their life, to defend their family's life, to defend their property. They won't be permitted to vote. They are essentially second-class citizens, and all they did was follow the law as they thought it was written, as it was written, as it was passed into law. You know, if this case doesn't outrage you, then perhaps you're listening to the wrong show. But if this case does get you fired up, if this case gets your juices flowing, if this gets you pumped up to fight for liberty, then you're in the right place, my friend. You are absolutely in the right place. And if you're listening to this show, if you're still listening right now, I really want to encourage you to, first of all, please share the show. This is a great show. This particular show, today's episode with KrisAnne Hall is a great show to share with your networks. KrisAnne has an incredible knowledge base, and she's so great at explaining these topics, these cases, to the detail. So it's a great show to share. But I also want to encourage you to go and rate the show. Rate the show on iTunes. Give us a 5-star rating. Leave a review. That helps us out more than you can imagine. And if you're new to Felony Friday, if you're new to the Lions of Liberty podcast, I want to encourage you to check out the Felony Friday archive. You can find it at felonyfriday.com. It has all of my past podcast episodes dating back to January of 2016. That's when we started the show a little over a year ago, so you can find that all there. And if you have some ideas for a show, if you have someone you'd like me to interview, a topic you'd like me to discuss on Felony Friday, you can send me an email. Send that email to felonyfriday@lionsofliberty.com. It's a couple more things, and I'll let you guys go. I do want to encourage you, if you have not yet joined the Lions of Liberty Forum, what are you waiting for? Just go to Facebook, type Lions of Liberty Forum in the search bar at the top, and join. And we'll get you approved as long as your profile looks like a real person. I do want to encourage you all. There are some ways that you can help us. You can help us to fund the show. You can help us to grow the show. We have a Lions of Liberty store. We have a t-shirt line. We're going to be having some koozies up. They could be up right now, actually, depending on when you're listening to this. There is another way that you can support the show on a more repeatable basis, on a monthly basis, and that is by becoming a patron of the Lions of Liberty, a monthly supporter of the Lions of Liberty. And you can do this by going to lionsofliberty.com/support. And you can donate any amount, as little or as much as you want to, but we do split it up into different tiers. So be sure to check that out. That's all I got for today, guys. Thank you so much for listening. This is John Odermatt signing off. Always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burning.